We live in an age of performance. Everywhere you look, people are curating their lives, broadcasting their experiences, crafting their digital personas. Social media has become a global stage where billions perform daily, competing for attention, validation, and relevance. The pressure to participate is enormous. If you're not posting, you're invisible. If you're not sharing, you don't exist. Or so the story goes. But in the midst of this collective performance, there exists a quiet resistance, a group of people who have consciously chosen to stay offline, to refuse the stage, to live their lives without the need for an audience. And here's what's fascinating. These aren't people who've been left behind by technology or who don't understand social media. They're often highly conscious individuals who've made a deliberate choice based on deep psychological insight. So what drives this choice? What makes someone opt out of the performance culture entirely? And what can Carl Jung, the pioneering psychologist who revolutionized our understanding of the human psyche, teach us about those who stay offline while everyone else performs? To understand this, we need to start with Jung's fundamental insight about the structure of the psyche. Jung proposed that our personality operates on multiple levels. At the surface, there's the conscious ego, your everyday sense of self, your identity as you know it. But beneath that lies the personal unconscious, the repository of forgotten memories, repressed experiences, and material that's not currently in awareness. And deeper still lies what Jung called the collective unconscious, a layer of the psyche shared by all humanity, containing universal patterns, instincts, and archetypal images that shape our behavior. Now here's where it gets interesting. Jung believed that psychological health requires maintaining a relationship with all these layers, not just living at the surface level of the conscious ego. You need to stay connected to the deeper layers, to the unconscious dimensions of your being, to develop what he called the self with a capital S, the unified totality of who you are. But social media operates almost entirely at the level of the conscious ego and persona. It's all about crafting your public identity, managing how others see you, performing a version of yourself for external consumption. The deeper layers, the personal unconscious, the collective unconscious, the shadow, the authentic self, these are largely absent from social media. In fact, social media actively discourages engagement with these deeper dimensions because they're messy, complex, and don't photograph well. People who stay offline while everyone performs have often recognized this fundamental limitation. They understand that living primarily at the level of persona and conscious ego is psychologically impoverishing. They need connection with the deeper layers of their psyche, and they've recognized that participating in social media performance would pull them away from that connection. So they choose to stay offline, not because they're afraid or technologically incompetent, but because they're prioritizing psychological depth over social performance. This is a profound act of self-knowledge and self-preservation. There's also something crucial happening with what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming your whole, authentic self. Jung believed that we all have a deep, instinctual urge to individuate, to develop our unique potential, to become who we truly are, rather than who society expects us to be. He called this urge a law of nature, and thus of invincible power. It's built into us, as fundamental as hunger or sexuality. But here's the problem. Individuation requires certain conditions. It needs time for reflection, space for self-examination, freedom from constant external judgment, and the courage to confront aspects of yourself that don't fit your idealized self-image. Social media undermines all of these conditions. It demands constant outward focus, rewards conformity to collective standards, subjects you to perpetual evaluation by others, and encourages you to present only the most polished, idealized version of yourself. People who stay offline have recognized that social media and individuation are fundamentally incompatible. If they want to become their authentic selves, they need to limit their exposure to environments that pull them toward collective conformity and persona inflation. By staying offline, they're protecting their individuation process. They're creating the psychological space necessary for genuine self-development. Jung would see this as a sign of psychological maturity, the ability to prioritize long-term authentic development over short-term social validation. There's also something profound about what happens when the urge to individuate is blocked. Jung observed that when people can't express their deep need for psychological growth and self-realization through healthy means, that energy doesn't just disappear. It gets redirected into compulsive, neurotic behaviors. People become workaholics, control freaks, obsessively concerned with trivial matters, anything to channel the blocked energy. Social media, in many ways, has become a collective outlet for blocked individuation energy. People who can't find genuine meaning and purpose in their lives pour their energy into curating their feeds, obsessively checking notifications, performing their identities for strangers. It's a displacement activity, something to do with the psychological energy that should be going into genuine self-development, but has no healthy outlet. People who stay offline have avoided this trap. They haven't allowed their individuation energy to be diverted into digital performance. They've kept that energy available for its proper purpose, actual psychological growth, genuine self-discovery, real development of their unique potential. This isn't smugness or superiority, it's psychological wisdom. They've recognized where their energy needs to go and protected it from being drained by activities that don't serve their deeper development. Let's also consider Jung's concept of the persona and its relationship to performance culture. The persona, as Jung described it, is the social mask we all wear, the public face we present to navigate society smoothly. It's necessary for social functioning. We all need some level of persona. But Jung warned about what happens when the persona becomes too important, when you start identifying with the mask, rather than remembering it's just a performance. You lose touch with your authentic self. You start living for external approval rather than internal truth. You become hollow, performing a role rather than being a person. Social media has created an environment where persona inflation is almost inevitable. The entire platform is designed around crafting and maintaining your public image. Every post is a piece of persona construction. And the more time you spend performing online, the more you identify with that performance until eventually you can't distinguish between the mask and your true self. People who stay offline have recognized this danger and consciously avoided it. They've chosen not to create an elaborate digital persona because they understand that maintaining it would require identifying with it, and that identification would pull them away from their authentic self. By staying offline, they're preserving the distinction between persona and self, between the mask they might wear in certain social situations and the deeper, more complex reality of who they actually are. Another profound aspect of why some people stay offline relates to Jung's understanding of the shadow. The shadow, in Jungian psychology, represents everything about ourselves that we don't want to acknowledge. The traits we're ashamed of, the impulses we suppress, the aspects of our personality that don't fit our idealized self-image. Jung believed that psychological health requires integrating the shadow, acknowledging and accepting these darker aspects rather than denying them. But social media makes shadow integration nearly impossible. The entire platform is built around presenting your best self, your highlights, your successes, your most flattering angles. There's no space for the messy reality of being human, for the struggles, the failures, the moments of pettiness or weakness or confusion. If you do share these things, you're expected to package them inspirationally, to turn your pain into content, to make your vulnerability serve a narrative purpose. People who stay offline have often done significant shadow work, and they understand that continuing that work requires privacy. They need space to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves without an audience. They need permission to be imperfect without it being documented. They need to acknowledge their less flattering qualities without worrying about how that acknowledgement will affect their reputation. By staying offline, they're protecting their ability to remain whole, to integrate all aspects of themselves, light and shadow, without splitting into a perfect public persona and a flawed private reality. This wholeness is what Jung considered the ultimate goal of psychological development, and it's nearly impossible to achieve while performing constantly for others. There's also something crucial happening with what Jung called psychic energy, or libido. Jung used this term not in the narrow sexual sense, but to describe the general life energy that powers all psychological activity. He observed that this energy is finite. You have only so much available each day, and how you spend it determines the quality of your psychological life. Every interaction, every decision, every creative act requires psychic energy, and performance is incredibly energy-intensive. Crafting posts, managing your image, monitoring responses, comparing yourself to others, dealing with the emotional impact of likes and comments, it all drains enormous amounts of psychic energy. People who stay offline have made a strategic calculation about energy expenditure. They've recognized that social media consumes more energy than it provides, and they've chosen to conserve their psychic energy for activities that genuinely nourish them. For creative work, for deep relationships, for personal growth, for simply living without the constant drain of performance anxiety. This isn't laziness. It's intelligent resource management based on self-knowledge. They know what energizes them and what depletes them, and they've organized their lives accordingly. Jung also understood something profound about collective possession, what happens when individuals lose their sense of self and become absorbed into group consciousness. He witnessed this phenomenon in the mass movements of his time, how entire populations could be gripped by archetypal forces, losing their individual judgment and moral autonomy. Social media has created conditions for collective possession on an unprecedented scale. Trends sweep through platforms like psychological contagions. Entire communities become gripped by shared emotions, outrage, enthusiasm, fear, without individuals even realizing they've lost their autonomy. The algorithms amplify whatever generates engagement, which tends to be content that triggers strong emotional reactions and tribal identification. People who stay offline have often recognized this danger. They've seen how easily others get swept up in collective emotions, how quickly nuance disappears, how powerfully group dynamics operate in digital spaces. And they've made a conscious choice to protect their psychological autonomy by staying out of these environments. By remaining offline, they maintain the distance necessary to think independently, to form their own opinions, to resist the pull of collective possession. This isn't antisocial behavior, it's psychological self-preservation. They're protecting their individuality from being absorbed into the digital collective. There's also something significant about what Jung observed regarding the modern loss of ritual and meaning. In traditional societies, people had clear rituals, ceremonies, and collective practices that provided psychological containment, helped process emotions, and connected individuals to something larger than themselves. Modern secular society has largely lost these structures, creating what Jung called a spiritual vacuum. Social media has emerged as a pseudo-ritual space where people attempt to fill this vacuum. The morning scroll becomes a ritual, the carefully composed post becomes a ceremony. The likes and comments become validation of your place in the community. But people who stay offline have recognized that these digital rituals are empty. They don't actually fulfill the deep psychological and spiritual needs that traditional rituals served. They're simulacra, imitations that look like the real thing but lack substance. Many people who stay offline have found or created genuine rituals and practices that actually provide meaning. Meditation, prayer, creative work, time in nature, deep conversation, service to others. These activities genuinely nourish the soul in ways that social media never could. They don't need digital performance to provide meaning because they've cultivated authentic sources of meaning in their lives. This is what Jung meant by psychological and spiritual maturity, finding genuine sources of nourishment rather than accepting cheap substitutes. Let's also consider Jung's understanding of introversion and the introvert's relationship with the outer world. Jung didn't define introversion as shyness or social anxiety. He described it as a fundamental orientation of psychic energy toward the inner world of thoughts, feelings, and reflections. Introverts, Jung observed, are energized by solitude and drained by excessive social stimulation. They need time alone to process experiences, to recharge, to simply be without external demands. Social media is particularly exhausting for introverts because it's constantly pulling attention outward. Even when you're physically alone, if you're on social media, you're socially engaged. You're consuming others' content, thinking about your own image, managing your digital presence. There's no true solitude, no genuine withdrawal from social demands. People who stay offline, many of whom are introverts, have protected their need for genuine solitude. They've recognized that being offline isn't just about not posting. It's about creating real space away from social engagement where they can turn fully inward, recharge their energy, and exist without reference to others. This isn't antisocial. It's honoring their psychological type. Jung believed that psychological health comes from accepting and working with your natural orientation rather than forcing yourself to be something you're not. Introverts who stay offline are doing exactly that. They're refusing to exhaust themselves trying to keep up with a platform designed for extroverts. There's another profound dimension to why some people stay offline that connects to Jung's concept of psychological projection. Jung discovered that much of what we see in others is actually a reflection of our own unconscious material. When you have a strong reaction to someone, positive or negative, it's often because they're embodying something that exists in your own psyche, but that you haven't fully acknowledged. This process, called projection, happens automatically and unconsciously. Social media is essentially a projection factory. Every feed is filled with hundreds of potential projection screens, people living lives that trigger your envy, your judgment, your admiration, your insecurity. And these projections aren't neutral. They affect your mood, your self-esteem, your sense of what's possible or normal. People who stay offline have often become aware of this projection dynamic, and they've chosen to limit their exposure to it. They understand that spending hours scrolling through others' curated lives would fill their psyche with projections that would then need to be processed, analyzed, and integrated. It's exhausting work, and much of it is unnecessary. By staying offline, they're not avoiding projection entirely. It happens in all human interactions, but they're limiting it to real-world encounters where the projections are more manageable and the relationships are substantial enough to warrant the psychological work. This is what Jung would call conscious living, being aware of your psychological processes and making choices that support your well-being rather than undermine it. There's also something crucial about what Jung called the compensatory function of the psyche. Jung observed that the unconscious tends to compensate for one-sided conscious attitudes. If you're too rational consciously, your unconscious will produce emotional dreams. If you're too focused on others, your unconscious will create fantasies of solitude. This compensation is the psyche's way of maintaining balance and wholeness. People who stay offline while everyone else performs may be engaging in conscious compensation. They see the extreme extroversion of social media culture, The constant performance, the relentless positivity, the obsessive focus on external image, and they consciously compensate by choosing introversion, privacy, honesty about the full spectrum of experience, and focus on internal development. This creates psychological balance. They're not swinging to the opposite extreme of complete isolation. They're finding a middle path that honors both their need for connection and their need for solitude, both their public roles and their private selves. Jung would recognize this as psychological wisdom, the ability to create balance in a culture that's become dangerously one-sided. Let's also consider what Jung understood about the relationship between consciousness and suffering. Jung believed that becoming conscious, truly aware of yourself and your patterns, inevitably involves suffering. You have to confront uncomfortable truths, acknowledge your limitations, face your shadow. But this suffering, he argued, is necessary and ultimately redemptive. It leads to growth, wisdom, and genuine transformation. Social media, by contrast, offers what might be called unconscious comfort. It provides endless distraction from difficult self-examination. It offers validation that soothes insecurity without addressing its roots. It creates the illusion of connection without the vulnerability that real intimacy requires. People who stay offline have often chosen conscious suffering over unconscious comfort. They'd rather face themselves honestly, even when it's painful, than distract themselves with digital performance. They understand that genuine psychological growth requires discomfort, and they're willing to sit with that discomfort rather than numbing it with scrolling, posting, and seeking validation. This willingness to suffer consciously for the sake of growth is what Jung considered a mark of psychological courage and maturity. There's also something profound about the relationship between staying offline and what Jung called the self, the archetype of wholeness and the organizing center of the psyche. Jung believed that the self exists beyond the ego, representing the totality of who you are, conscious and unconscious, known and unknown. He argued that psychological development involves a gradual shift from ego-centeredness to self-centeredness, from living according to the ego's desires for recognition and success to living according to the self's deeper purpose and meaning. Social media is almost entirely ego-focused. It's about building your personal brand, accumulating followers, gaining recognition, achieving visible success. The self, with its concerns for meaning, wholeness, and authentic being, has little place in this environment. People who stay offline are often those who've begun to orient their lives around the self rather than the ego. They're less interested in external recognition and more interested in internal alignment. They're less concerned with how their lives appear and more concerned with whether their lives feel meaningful. They've made what Jung would call the crucial shift from ego to self, and staying offline is a natural expression of that shift. They don't need the ego gratification that social media provides because they've found something deeper and more satisfying. Jung also understood something about what he called active imagination, the practice of engaging with unconscious material through conscious attention and dialogue. This involves allowing images, feelings, and thoughts from the unconscious to emerge and then engaging with them consciously rather than just being swept along by them. It's a sophisticated psychological practice that requires quiet, solitude, and uninterrupted internal focus. Social media makes active imagination nearly impossible. Its constant stimulation keeps consciousness directed outward, leaving no space for unconscious material to emerge. Its rapid pace prevents the kind of sustained attention that active imagination requires. People who stay offline often have, consciously or unconsciously, protected their ability to engage in this kind of inner work. They've maintained access to their unconscious, to the dreams, intuitions, and insights that emerge when consciousness is quiet and receptive. This access gives their lives a depth and richness that's difficult to achieve When your attention is constantly fragmented by digital stimulation, there's also something to be said about what Jung called psychological types and the thinking function. Jung identified thinking as one of the four primary psychological functions, alongside feeling, sensation, and intuition. People for whom thinking is a dominant function are primarily concerned with understanding, with making sense of things, with developing logical frameworks and coherent worldviews. Social media is particularly frustrating for people with dominant thinking functions because it operates on emotional reaction rather than careful thought. Nuance gets lost. Complexity gets reduced to slogans. Logical analysis gets dismissed as overthinking. People who stay offline often have strong thinking functions, and they've recognized that social media doesn't value what they have to offer. Rather than force themselves to communicate in ways that don't honor their natural cognitive style, they've chosen to opt out entirely. They're finding or creating contexts where thinking is valued, where complexity is welcome, where intellectual rigor is appreciated, and those contexts are rarely on social media platforms designed for quick emotional reactions and viral simplicity. Perhaps the most profound truth about people who stay offline while everyone performs relates to Jung's understanding of what he called the teleological nature of the psyche. Jung believed that the psyche isn't just shaped by past causes, but is also drawn forward by future purposes. We're not just products of our history, we're also oriented toward becoming something, toward realizing our potential, toward fulfilling what Jung called our individual destiny or calling. This teleological orientation, this sense of being called toward something, is fundamentally incompatible with the logic of social media performance. Social media operates on metrics, measurements, comparisons, competition. It asks, how many followers do you have? How much engagement are you getting? How do you compare to others? But the teleological orientation asks completely different questions. What are you becoming? What is your unique purpose? What is trying to emerge through your life? People who stay offline have often developed a strong sense of this teleological pull. They feel called towards something that can't be measured in likes or followers. They're oriented toward a purpose that requires depth, authenticity, and sustained effort rather than constant performance and immediate feedback. By staying offline, they're protecting their ability to follow this calling without distortion. They're refusing to let external metrics replace their internal sense of purpose. They're choosing to be guided by what Jung would call the self's wisdom, rather than the ego's desire for recognition. This is what genuine psychological and spiritual maturity looks like, living according to your deepest purpose, rather than society's expectations. There's also something crucial about the relationship between staying offline and what Jung called the opus, the work of self-transformation that each person must undertake. Jung often used alchemical metaphors to describe psychological development, speaking of the slow transformation of base material into gold, of darkness into light, of the unconscious into consciousness. This work, he emphasized, happens in sealed vessels, away from external observation. It requires privacy, containment, protection from premature exposure. People who stay offline are often engaged in this opus, this deep transformative work on themselves. They're confronting their shadows, integrating their complexes, working through their wounds, developing their unique capacities. And they understand instinctively that this work must happen privately. Documenting it on social media would violate its integrity, would turn sacred transformation into public spectacle, would expose vulnerable processes to judgment and interference. By staying offline, they're creating the sealed vessel that Jung knew was necessary for genuine transformation. They're protecting the sacred work of becoming whole. Let's also consider what Jung understood about symbols and their role in psychological life. Jung believed that symbols are the language of the unconscious, the way deeper layers of the psyche communicate with consciousness. But symbols, he emphasized, aren't merely signs pointing to known meanings. True symbols carry meanings that can't be fully articulated, that exceed rational understanding, that connect us to depths we can't consciously access. Social media has a strange relationship with symbols. Images are everywhere, but they function mostly as signs rather than symbols. A vacation photo signifies I'm having a good time. A workout picture signifies I'm disciplined. A relationship post signifies I'm loved. These are communications of information, not genuine symbolic experiences. People who stay offline often have a more developed relationship with genuine symbols. They encounter them in dreams, in art, in nature, in moments of profound experience. And they understand that these symbolic encounters are too precious, too mysterious, too sacred to be reduced to social media posts. They need to sit with the symbols, allow them to work on their psyche, let their meanings unfold slowly over time. This relationship with genuine symbolic experience is central to Jungian psychology, and it's largely incompatible with social media's demand for immediate, explicit communication. There's also something profound about what happens to moral and ethical development when you stay offline. Jung believed that genuine ethics emerge from self-knowledge and individuation, not from following collective rules. When you know yourself deeply, when you've integrated your shadow, when you've become conscious of your motivations, you naturally develop an internal ethical sense that's more sophisticated than mere rule-following. But developing this internal ethics requires space for moral reflection, for considering difficult questions without easy answers, for sitting with ethical ambiguity. Social media undermines this process. It creates moral mobs where ethical positions must be stated clearly and immediately. There's no room for uncertainty, for working through complex moral questions, for arriving at nuanced positions through careful thought. People who stay offline have protected their ability to develop this kind of sophisticated internal ethics. They can consider moral questions deeply, change their minds as they learn more, hold paradoxical positions, and develop ethical stances that don't fit neatly into social media's binary thinking. This moral seriousness, this refusal to reduce ethics to performative statements, is what Jung would consider genuine moral development. Jung also spoke about what he called the wisdom of the second half of life, a natural turning inward that happens as people mature. He observed that in youth, we're naturally oriented outward, toward achievement, recognition, building our place in the world. But as we mature, there's a natural shift toward inner concerns, toward meaning rather than success, toward being rather than doing, toward wisdom rather than achievement. Many people who stay offline, regardless of their chronological age, seem to be operating from this second half of life orientation. They're no longer interested in the first half of life games of competition and accumulation. They're asking different questions now. What really matters? Who am I beneath all my achievements? What gives life meaning? What legacy am I creating? These questions can't be answered on social media. They require the kind of deep inner work that only happens in silence, solitude, and sustained reflection. By staying offline, these individuals are honoring their developmental stage, refusing to keep playing games that no longer serve their growth. Finally, there's something to be said about the ultimate paradox that Jung understood deeply, that true connection with others requires first being deeply connected with yourself. Jung believed that genuine relationships happen between individuated selves, people who've done the work of becoming conscious, integrating their shadows, and developing their unique authenticity. When you haven't done this work, your relationships are really just exchanges between personas, masks interacting with masks. But when you have done this work, when you know yourself deeply, you can meet others at a depth that's genuinely transformative. People who stay offline while everyone performs are often prioritizing this deeper kind of connection. They're choosing to invest their social energy in relationships that involve genuine vulnerability, authentic communication, and mutual growth. They understand that the shallow connections of social media, hundreds of followers but no one who really knows you, are worse than no connection at all. They'd rather have 3 genuine friendships than 3,000 digital acquaintances. This isn't antisocial, it's deeply social in the truest sense, oriented toward real human connection rather than its digital simulation. In the end, people who stay offline while everyone performs aren't missing out. They're opting into something deeper, richer, and more psychologically nourishing. They're choosing individuation over conformity, depth over display, authenticity over performance, the self over the ego, genuine connection over digital simulation, and the slow work of becoming whole over the frenetic pace of constant visibility. Carl Jung would recognize these individuals not as failures to adapt, but as psychological pioneers, people who've understood something that mass culture hasn't yet grasped. That genuine psychological health, authentic human connection, and meaningful existence require something social media can't provide: the courage to live privately, consciously, and fully without needing the world to watch.